Okay, welcome everyone to our afternoon session today, our first one of this afternoon. We are joined today by Kevin Wilson, who joined Boston Conservatory's voice faculty in 2008 and is head of vocal pedagogy. He teaches applied voice for musical theater and vocal performance, as well as courses in vocal pedagogy. As a vocal pedagogue, diagnostician, and rehabilitator, he aims to dedicate voice habilitation for his students, and as a result, his students have performed in venues like the Metropolitan Opera, the Chicago Lyric Opera, New York City Opera, Boston Lyric Opera, as well on this Broadway stage in Hamilton, Cats, Beetlejuice, and many more shows. He's a sought-after clinician, adjudicator, and master teacher, and has given master classes and lectures in vocal health and musical theater and classical pedagogies throughout the United States, Europe, and Asia. And in 2019, he was a master teacher in the NAC's intern program. So we welcome Kevin Wilson.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for taking a little bit of your morning to join me this morning. So one of the things that I love to talk about when I have the opportunity to talk to teachers is to talk about how we teach musical theater. And I think in some ways that can feel like, well, we all teach musical theater, but I think like many of you, I was a classically trained singer and who had a classical pedagogy. And then the beginning of my teaching career was all musical theater students. And I had to figure out very quickly how to teach this aesthetic, because I realized that a lot of the things that I had learned around my classical singing were not going to benefit the musical theater singing students. But I did want to keep a little bit of honesty, and I wanted to keep a little bit of honor to that traditional training that I had received, and then try to tweak that a little bit for my own use to kind of help my students get to where they need to go and really help them kind of achieve the aesthetic that we need as singers to be successful in musical theater. And it's a big responsibility teaching a musical theater voice, because you're teaching a student to basically have 5 voices that are their own voices. And so we'll talk a little bit about that today. So I'm gonna share my screen with you. One second, and I made notes. And those of you who are attending today, I sent Nathan some handouts that you can have after the presentation today. And those handouts are vocal exercises for cultivating the head and chest and mixed voice in a musical theater student. So those will be available to you if you're interested in having those. And because we're such a small group this morning, can everybody see my screen? Give me a thumbs up. Nathan, can you see it? Okay, good. Since we're such a small group this morning, I would like for you to feel comfortable and feel free to either type something into the chat if you have a question. I'm getting pretty good about being able to see that at the same time. Or if you'd just like to interrupt me and just unmute your microphone and call out, that is totally fine. I'm so used to that because we've all been teaching in this medium now, so we might as well just embrace what it is. All right. So today's lecture or presentation, basically, I call everything a lecture, is about how we teach belt, mix, and contemporary legit to our students. And it will seem a little bit cis-female, assigned female at birth, heavy, because I think that is kind of like the big kind of elusive thing when we're teaching musical theater right now, is learning how to navigate the passaggio for the female voice. But I will make some light on how we're teaching males as well. And you'll see that this is kind of, the information is going to be cross usable between both sexes. So basically, I'm here because I want to have a conversation about how we can use all the information that we currently have and build on that information so that we can be really effective in how we communicate to our students and giving them the tools that they need. Because musical theater singing isn't just about belting. There's a lot of things that are required. So a cis female student's gonna need to belt to a D5. and we'll talk about what that belt is and what types of students will be doing that. Going to have to mix to a G5 or have a sound that sounds like a mix, and then sing legit to a B flat 5. So that's a huge responsibility for one voice to be able to make all of these sounds. And I think the old kind of adage around this is that musical theater singing is bad for the voice. This has kind of gone away, and because we have research saying that actually cross-training in the studio is giving longevity to singers, because they learn how to use their voice to its capacity and learn how to use the variables, the things that we can change about our vocal tract versus our vocal folds to make these things happen. So, and there was also, for years, teachers were terrified in the classical world to have their cis-female students singing in their chest voice because they thought it would destroy their head voice. We know that that's no longer true. We know that there's significant benefit to the chest voice being cultivated in classical singers as well. So this is how I really start to think about how I'm teaching in the studio. So it's all how we change the filter. So the vocal folds obviously are doing all the work that they normally do, right? So we've got 5-fold, we have down to 3-fold, depending on thickness and fullness throughout the range. But where the biggest change happens that gives us the distinct qualities between classical and the musical theater sound are in the vocal tract. So these are the major variables that we can change. So we have the soft palate, we have obviously laryngeal position, we have the tongue, we have the lips, we have the jaw. All those big variables that are going to allow us to shape sound to meet the aesthetic need for the industry. And we also have some potential narrowing in the aryepiglottic sphincter, and we'll talk a little bit about what that creates in the sound. So I'm going to just bring up a little bit around registration, just because if you're a person who's like, I don't really have to understand registration, then you have joined the world of scientists who don't understand it either. It's super controversial. And I was presenting at a conference in Belgium at the Pan-European Voice Conference, and there was Ingo Tietze and Johan Sunderberg and the brilliant person from France who created the mode 0, 1, 2, mode 3. And not one of those people on that panel agreed with the other person. They all had their own kind of ideas, but also agreed to disagree. So please, if you're using modes, you're using head voice, chest voice, or you're using loft and hoot, or whatever you want to call it, know that it's okay as long as your students understand what it is that you're talking about. So this is my model for registration. Okay, so the model is basically that we have the chest voice and we have the head voice, right? But I think of those two things most of the time being connected, right? We shouldn't be hearing major registration shifts in our singers once we have organized their voices, right? So we have the thyroarytenoid thickness, the vocal fold is thicker, and then we move up into cricothyroid dominance, and the vocal folds are potentially thinner. But everything is kind of just on this continuum. And I like this definition of continuum, a continuous sequence in which adjacent elements are not perceptibly different from each other, although the extremes are quite distinct. So if we're completely in the chest voice, you can definitely hear that quality. If we are completely in the very, very top part of our head voice, you can hear that those are very quite distinct differences. But everything in the middle should have kind of qualities of both. And as we are journeying through the passaggio, the one thing that we do know about the passaggio is that we do have to make some adjustments in that passaggio that are vowel related, which means articulator related and shaping related. But we know that that's really going to be what's going to change there is resonance and our breath. So that's really what is it's just resonance and breath changes that are happening in both of the first and the second passaggio. So this is just kind of a good way, in my opinion, to really think about this with our students, that we kind of have a teeter-totter, so to speak, that sometimes we have more chest voice and sometimes we have more a head voice. but we don't have just one or the other. And that's really what we want to train out of all of our singers, including classical. All right. So we hear a lot about mixing, and some people refer to this as a mixed register, right? And so we can fight about this all day long, or we can just agree to disagree about this. And the idea is that what I just said, that we have varying degrees of dominance between the head voice and the chest voice as they are being presented. And so most studies are just suggesting that this is just resonance adjustments rather than muscular adjustments to the voice source. So less about what's happening to the vocal folds themselves and more about the resonance that's kind of happening. So it begs to question, if you are a cultivated classical singer or a musical theater singer, aren't we kind of singing mostly in a mix all the time? As we get closer to the bottom, the vocal folds start getting thicker, or the richness starts getting perceivably thicker. As we move towards the top, we have perceivably lighter or different colors and different access. So that's just something that we want to think about, okay? So the next thing I'm going to talk about a little bit is not a register, but a kind of a phenomenon that we have kind of created in musical theater singing. That's something that we use. Now, it's called twang, and if you're an Estel person, you call it twang. If you're a person who's kind of into contemporary commercial music, you don't use the word twang because it's been kind of shunned a little bit. But there is something acoustically happening in the narrowing in the vocal fold, above the vocal folds and also in the pharyngeal walls a little bit, that is changing the quality of sound that we hear. And so a lot of times this is referred to as a witch noise or a screaming baby or a cat or a banshee. And why we use this in musical theater is it's going to increase the acoustic energy significantly and also increase the perceived sound significantly. So if I'm singing wee in my falsetto and then I add a little bit of this narrowing, wee, 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 you can hear the perceived difference and how potentially the second sound, which has a little bit of narrowing in it, is going to give me a little bit more, a higher frequency, which means the sound is going to carry a little bit further and be perceivably louder. And this phenomenon is just purely the same thing as if you're blowing on the top of a bottle, and there's a lot of space in that bottle. You're going to blow across it. It's going to be a warm, low tone. If that bottle has a lot of liquid in it, it's going to be a higher frequency. Or if you understand pipe organs, it's the same thing. The big pipes are the low ones, and the short, skinny pipes are the higher frequency, high-pitched tones, right? And that's kind of what we're doing, is we're shaping our vocal tract to be a little bit more narrow so that we can get this perceived twang. And people freak out about it when they hear it. They're like, oh no. Well, babies kind of do this a little bit. Babies are the most effective sound machines. And we know that if you have one, you know that because they need to be heard to let us know that they're hungry or something's wrong. But it is also one of the most effective tools for voice rehabilitation around muscle tension dysphonia and also vocal paralysis. So it's kind of important to know about. But also, when students are doing this, it does not mean that there's additional effort on the voice itself. All of the muscles that are becoming involved, and we'll see them in a second, are actually above the level of the vocal folds. So it's not produced in the area, it's not produced in the vocal folds itself, it's produced in the filter above it. So currently, we've always thought that was the aryepiglottic sphincter. There's some new evidence saying that it has to do with a little bit of the epilarynx, which is actually not a term we use in American concepts of voice teaching. Epilarynx is actually a French term for the speech-language pathology and scientific world, but it just means epi just means above the larynx, so it's just slightly above the larynx, but still not in the vocal folds. And note that if you're having a student who's getting scoped and they're singing in this method, it will present as tension because what they're seeing in the scope is just a little bit of narrowing. Okay, so here is a slice from front to back. So this is your tongue, this is your epiglottis, These are your ventricular folds, okay? These are technically you're known as your false folds. We only use those to growl. And then we have the true vocal folds here. So this is the space that gets just a little bit more narrow. So this is more classical posture. We call this kind of open. And then we get a little bit narrow here. And that's what's creating that, yay, hey guys, sound in the tone, okay? And the first time you get your students to make some of these noises, they're going to be like, are you sure I can do this in public? Until they do, and then you can't get them to stop because it sounds impressive. And it's very much part of what a mixed belt presentation, okay? So one of the things that we have to understand as teachers is that a belt is not a belt is not a belt. And not every student will be able to belt the same way, okay? So a standard belt, which we kind of associate with the Betty Buckleys and the Ethel Mermans, if you look at that repertoire when we didn't have microphones to project off the stage for singing, that repertoire rarely goes above a C. So if you're looking at like Annie Get Your Gun, we're not looking at big extensions above a C. So we're kind of keeping everything in the capability of staying in a speech range, and then everything gets modified to something open, like like if you listen to Ethel Merman sing "You Can't Get a Man with a Gun," she sings "You can't get a man with a gun." Everything is open, and rarely will you find something that goes up to a D5, but you might. But it'll just be kind of a squawk up, and then you get away from it. More things around the standard belt so you understand it. It's purely just chest register extension and really keeping in a TA dominance all the way up as high as you can go, which has to be probably cultivated. There's no registration negotiation towards the cricothyroid in the first passaggio, which a mixed belt will start to do. There's a lot of subglottic pressure. There's a long closed phase in the vocal folds. The vocal folds are going to close very, very quickly and have a very, very strong adduction of the muscles that are responsible for closing the vocal folds, the lateral cricoretinoid and the interretinoids, both the oblique and the transverse. So they're going to really squeeze and drop down those vocal folds. So the medial compression is so strong that the subglottic pressure can be very strong as well. And there's a kind of that balance and resistance to that. Again, it's using these vowels. There's a much lower jaw position, more towards kind of like a classical position. And that's going to take advantage of the speech formant, which is 4,000 hertz versus the singer's formant at 3,000 hertz. So we can see the benefit of that. But I don't know if there's a benefit of teaching standard belt anymore. So this is kind of what people say, oh, I'm going to teach my student to belt. Let's take their chest voice as high as it can go. Well, I don't think that's always necessary. So the mixed belt, which is where most of the music that we're listening to now, because think about the tessitura of a contemporary musical theater piece now. It's high, right? So we're asking students to belt and sustain between a B flat 5, B flat 4 to an F5. So we're asking those students to sustain in a tessitura that sounds like belt in a place where the chest voice cannot stay, right? We cannot keep that thickness of the chest voice. So we need to give something that is perceivable as a belt in that part of the voice, in that tessitura. So we're going to have an increased nasalence, okay? And so let's talk about the difference between nasality and nasalence. So nasalence is just the measure of the acoustic energy that's getting into the nasal cavity, right? So that doesn't mean that it's nasality, right? So I'm talking to you now with nasalence. If I plug my nose, my tone sounds mostly the same if I stay away from N or M, which have to go through the mouth, okay? So that is nasalence, right? Nasality would be this. It would be completely closed off, right? So a lot of the things that I talk to my students about is finding tone that is behind the nose, but not in the nose. Sorry about the ambulances going by. I live on a much busy street. Okay. So the difference between nasality and nasalence is very important to kind of understand. And so, especially when we're helping our students find this kind of twang sound, hey, hey, that has nothing to do with nasality, right? Even though that may appear and sound to the ear and present to the ear as nasal, right? So I use in my studio, I have surgical nose clips. They're just round plastic clips. They're called snuffers, SNUFFER. And you can order a box of like 100 of them online. And I just give them all to my students. And then it's just a nose plug. You could also use a swimming nose plug for those people who don't like water up their nose. And it's a good way to find out how forward the students could get before they actually, how much nasalence can they have introduced to the tone. So I think it's important to just kind of play with that with your students and understand that they're going to know that there's going to be that presence, that forward, especially for classical singers who are going back and forth. It takes a little bit of time to kind of get used to that hey sound in the singing, right? So it's not a high laryngeal position. That's what people always say. It's like, oh, belting is a higher laryngeal position. No, belting is neutral, slightly lower, but never high. And we also have lots of variable vocal tract shaping, and we're going to talk about how we do that with our students in the next few slides. Again, always a change above the vocal folds. The vocal folds are not taking the brunt. And if you look at the difference in the vowel modifications, instead of moving towards an or a or all open vowels, we're going more towards closed and a, which are both bringing the tongue into a higher back position, right? And that is keeping the tongue from being in an open in a lower position, which would then depress the larynx and get us a little bit more into of a heavier tone. So you're going to carry, if the tongue is depressing the larynx, you will carry weight through your first passaggio, and then you will start to standard belt. So learning how to navigate that first passaggio with it being transitions of color and starting to bring in a little bit more nasalence is what's going to allow for that transition up into the head voice to happen without the weight. So and I have a vowel chart coming up that you can screenshot if you're interested. So where do I begin teaching this? Body awareness and fitness. Too many times my students walk in the door for the first time for a lesson and they have zero connection with anything in the lower part of their body. They don't do body work. They don't do squats and get down into their body and do stretches that get the whole entire body organized. And we have to make sure that their respiratory system, their phonatory system, their articulator system, and their resonators have all been accessed every single day before they begin to sing. So making sure that our warm-ups that we're giving our students are technically what that is, a warm-up, a stretch to the mechanism before we start vocalizing, which is technique building. So if the muscles aren't stretched, if the tongue isn't stretched, if the jaw, the soft palate, the body isn't ready to respond with the breath that we want, if we haven't opened up our body, so to speak, we haven't realigned our posture, not by prescribing it, by discovering it through different types of movement, then we are actually limiting our students' success by just starting off with the traditional vocalizing of 5-note 9-tone scales, okay? Always make sure with musical theater that we have mostly balanced onsets, so simultaneous, instantaneous coordination. Every once in a while a glottal, every once in a while an aspirate is fine, but you can't just say, oh, you're singing musical theater, you can have aspirate onsets all the time, because then you're going to fatigue and potentially damage the student. I think it's also important to always establish what is the difference between a neutral jaw and an interdependent tongue, that the tongue can have function without the jaw moving. So I see this all the time. People go, ya, 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 ya. If my tongue and my jaw are that married together and my tongue can't make that adjustment without my jaw, then what's going to happen is that student is going to be using a lot of accessory muscles to assist in the tongue being where it wants to be and the jaw fighting being kind of a participation in that. So think about exercises that you can do that allow your tongue, which is connected to your soft palate, which is connected to your chin, which is connected to your hyoid bone, and connected to up into your styloid process and next to your masseter. It's important that you stretch the tongue so that it is, because it is the greatest variable and it does change a lot in the quality of sound that we're making. So that's just really important for you just to make sure that you're doing. And also, musical theater, we can be a little bit more neutral. And I actually teach my classical students to do this well, to be neutral in the lower part of the voice with the jaw, instead of trying to get to the bottom where you're singing with a low jaw. That you neutralize the jaw a little bit to bring it a little bit closer to speech. Montserrat Caballé does this. Renato Tebaldi does this. So we can borrow it from musical theater as well. And then the most important thing is to, in vocalizing, start to establish the primal response in your students. Because we all already have so much coordination in our bodies around singing that if we don't honor what we already know, what we're doing is we're prescribing things that we don't know. So figure out what your student knows. Can your students whine? Can they go, "I want a cookie"? Probably. Can they take a breath and be really excited and go, "Oh my God"? Can they take a breath and be really mad? No! All of those things activate breath, activate resonators, activate different postures in our mouth for that resonance. And they're things that we are already conditioned to do. So if you spend 40 minutes trying to get your student to figure out what a poggio feels like, but you could have eliminated that 40 minutes by having that students take what I call the Karen or Kevin breath, where they're about to yell at somebody at Costco for taking the last roll of toilet paper. There's a natural kind of posturing where they kind of hunker down, bend the knees a little bit, and then they give a good holler. And that is all transverse and internal, external, oblique, abdominal muscle activity. And then they also are going to change their resonator so everybody hears that they're really mad about not getting that roll of toilet paper. So figure out what your students can do through the primal, natural response of the body before you prescribe it. And even if you... Every time I do this, I tell people to take a breath like they're really, really mad. Their nostrils flex and their mouths are closed. I tell them to take a breath like they're excited. The jaw drops and their soft palate goes up. So figure out what's already there before you start prescribing. So step one, balancing the cricothyroid and thyroarytenoid laryngeal flexibility. All parts of the voice must be organized to sing musical theater. You cannot just have a chest voice and a terrible head voice, because you will limit yourself to 10% of musical theater music. And I also move all of my students through whistle tones, through staccato exercises to the very, very top of their voice, and vocalize all the way down as low as possible, getting access to almost to all of my female singers to a low G or lower if they can actually manage that. Because the music is going to require them to do that. Understanding, getting flexibility in the larynx is really about just getting it loose. So this is one of the big things I hear all the time in classical students is they lower their larynx and they basically anchor that larynx very, very low. And then what happens is after a while, they start to get an actual wobble. So to try and free those students out of that, or even free students who have what I call a tremolo or like a bleed, a very rapid vibrato, that's tension, is tension as well. So exercises that you can do, actually wobbling, are all really healthy for your students to feel how they can move that larynx, and that larynx is moving to negotiate sound. Your breathing must be negotiated. You cannot take a full giant breath to just say, "I love you," right? If you just do that right now, "I love you," right? Your larynx lowers with a giant breath, and guess what we're doing in mixed musical theater singing? We are neutralizing the larynx, not lowering the larynx. When I take that big giant breath, so a half breath, a mezzo respiro, or a sip of breath, it's just slightly lowering it. If I take that big giant breath for singing classical, then my larynx wants to depress as well. So you want to make sure that we're not telling our students to have a neutral larynx and then making them take breaths that are lowering it, and then they're having to fight that from the onset. Also understanding that prephonatory set, that's what happens as you are breathing in, right, which we just talked about. The articulatory freedom is important, and then also just trying to find whistle tones. If you have a student who has a very weak head voice, sometimes they have whistle tones, and organizing in those whistle tones every once in a while, just kind of sustaining them, will give enough squeeze to the vocal folds so that they can actually get some medial compression and clean up their head voice tone a little bit. So I encourage you to just explore and try that. The next thing we want to do is free the speech, right? So I say always start in the speech register because that is where the student is the most comfortable and they've been using their voice all day long. So I want my students to know that chest voice is a color. It is not weight. And the minute that I give my students permission to stop slam dunking into the chest voice and just going in, and just using it as if they are speaking, it takes away that large imbalance that starts to happen in the bottom part of the voice. And oftentimes I like to work the voice from top down and when I'm starting to kind of free the speech. So kind of starting around C, D, E, and then moving through that area. And I use phrases like no, not now, and I don't want to go, and where's my mommy? And we try to play with resonance variables. So I have all of my students have kind of organized 5 voices for me. So we have the hootiest and we have the pingiest, right? So the hootiest one, no, not now, no, not now, no, not now, no, not now, no, not now. And then I have them go back and forth between these voices. And then sometimes I'll say, okay, let's use a 3 to sing this song or a 4 to sing this song. And it's amazing how much your students already know about making these sounds that you don't have to prescribe them to them. You can ask them after they've made the noise, do you feel what you are changing? And oftentimes the information they give you, because they have discovered it, will stay with them for a very long time. So I think that's very important to think about. Also making sure that the larynx remains neutral in the speech so that we don't see the larynx slam down. I don't want to go. That's a very classical posture. Neutral. I don't want to go. I don't want to go. And the larynx can be lifted slightly through that as well. I don't use the word support in my studio, so we use the concept of flow and resistance. To me, support sounds like something is being held. And so we're always working on finding flow first. And then if we need to add a little bit resistance in, then we'll find a reason to add in that resistance, whether it be emotional or dynamic influenced. But it's just important for me that my students learn to control that kind of flow and resistance in the beginning, using also a standard American dialect for the vowels is very important because no one wants to hear someone sing a finishing the hot, how you have to finish the hot, right? We don't need those overly modified vowels. We need speech language, colloquial vowels in our singing. And so one way to kind of get the speech to move into singing is doing what I call the extended monologue. Finishing the hat, how you have to finish the hat. And it just gives the students awareness that they're carrying their voice on the vowels and that the consonants are energizing those vowels. Step 3 is all about coordinating the head voice in speech. So I use like what I call the little child or the little girl voice. How are you? Why? What are you doing? So this is helping establish that we can have a smaller space in that speaking because sometimes we have to have a speech tone in the head voice. And if we go to the head voice always thinking that head voice means loft, oh no, why? Then we don't have the ability to start to make what it feels like that mixed placement. So I use things like yoo-hoo and yoo-hoo back and forth so they can feel the difference of the organization. And you can hear even in my falsetto how the tone changes more towards something that sounds like a contemporary sound. Yoo-hoo, yoo-hoo, my, again, we can play with all of those laryngeal variations and variables of the sound in that kind of 1 through 5 placement, okay? Also working on extending the monologue up there. Finishing the hat, how you have to finish the hat, are just fun ways to kind of play, okay? And then the most important thing, obviously, we've started to access the chest voice. We've started to access the head voice through speech, through organization. And then what I like to do is then start working on blending the register from the middle of the voice down, okay? So we're going to try and work on finding those narrow vowels of A and A. And the best way that I really find to kind of get things organized, and I really encourage you to try this, is 2 things. One is just have students speak kind of starting on the middle of their voice, maybe on a D or an F, depending on how high they speak. And you can just do repetitive 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and work them up until you feel like something's going to change. And then go a third above that and bring in the German U umlaut, E. So U in the lips, E in the tongue, and use the exercise. E, making sure that the tongue is a high backed E, like it should be anyhow. E, and the lips are in an U, which is a very long U. E, E, E. And as they come down that scale, most singers, classical and musical theater, will start to transition into their chest without having a major event happen, which is what we want. And if the major event does happen, right? Something happens where we want to kind of get caught. Don't do anything major, just change maybe the breath first, right? And then if that's not working, then shake it out. And then go back to it. Disorganize, reorganize, okay? And then playing with those emotional variables. So on the mix, so maybe finding something that's right just under where that voice wants to break. So maybe on an F, and have them go, why? But I'll do it higher. Why? So you're organizing how much activity they need in their breath, that you're organizing that they do have dynamic range in their ability to do this, and then take that higher and higher and higher. And you're going to start to find that if you organize the breath pressure from not being a big loud thing first, that they can feel a flow moving through their mechanism, right? And also, messa di voce, that is a thing. Let's not let that die. It's dying in all art forms. It is the most beautiful thing to hear a student have that kind of control over their instrument to tell their authentic story, okay? So here's the vowel modification chart. If everybody wants to play a little bit, you can put your finger on your larynx and just swallow. It'll go up. And then if I lower my jaw without thinking about my palate lifting, I just make a noise. Ah. Now go ah, e. Ah, e. So notice how the E is going to raise the larynx a little bit. Now go ah, ah, That's going to start to lower the larynx a little bit. So if we lower the larynx, it's going to add more weight. If we raise the larynx, well, we know what that sounds like. So we want to keep the larynx mostly neutral or slightly lower. So if your vowel is ah, e, open vowels, we modify them to more closed. So like ah with an a, so there's more a in that. Or a, as opposed to e, using the German U umlaut again for open E. Or using the OE combo. That is going to help your students navigate through that first passaggio or the second passaggio for males into what sounds like more of a mixed sound versus a open belt kind of placement. And these are vowels modifications that I use with my mezzos who are singing, who have fairly decent careers in opera houses. This is what we're using to kind of get that registration in the bottom so that they're not slamming chest into the bottom of their voice. And a good way to kind of play with this is what I call the soft palate hand jive. And you can basically just take your students' music and tell them to draw a line all the way through, maybe E if it's Rodgers and Hammerstein, which is lower, a G if it's mixed belt, maybe a B flat 4 if it's a high belt kind of piece. And what you want them to do is actually show you their understanding of registration. So they're going to sing something up here would sound like, this is their loft, kind of head voicey sound, and then down here in their chest. And so they're actually going to go back and forth between and eventually around that line where they're making those switches is going to get a little confused, and they're going to start to mix. It is just confusing the mechanism from a way of what they think they should be doing. But it's also, a broken voice sometimes is the easiest, broken meaning that it allows itself to break, is the easiest to put together versus the voice that has all the musculature involved to try to keep that from ever happening. Let the crack happen and then navigate it from the other side versus creating the tension to keep it from happening. And then you're going to be winding yourself undone for a very long time. So extending the chest is the last thing that I ever do with my students. And some of my students never need to have chest extension up to a D. I might cap them out at a B flat and teach them how to mix everything above that. It just depends. I find that natural mezzos, like real mezzos, not the everybody in musical theater calls themselves a mezzo people, actually have the ability to get the chest to go that high. For example, I have a student who is that was in the national tour of the Janis Joplin musical, and of course she had to belt really high, and so that was something that she could do. So we taught her to do it, and she's perfectly fine making all those crazy noises. But this can come from traditional things from calling. We get these exercises from Arthur Lesack. You get some of the Mary Saunders Barton things like, hey, see where the jaw is? No way, nasty, get out and stay out, right? So we have some open kind of beltier sounds that can kind of happen there. And the jaw can slightly lower, but the larynx is not going to be super low. It's still going to stay very neutral, okay? So always ask your students, how does it feel? And versus how does it sound? So you're kind of voice mapping. Give your students permission to play. Come back with different character voices. Like I say, come back with a song and sing it to me in 2 different character voices. That's pretty good to tell you how much control that student has around their instrument, right? Start tying an emotional response, especially in start maybe using that in your vocalizing, so that your students are basically learning to sing with emotion in the voice studio versus just having to do it on stage. Don't abandon traditional vocalizing. Check out that behind the nose, not in the nose situation. And again, encourage your students to play. Here are a few common issues we see: depressing the larynx with the tongue. So we have that open place. Using an old school belt, open vowels, in a contemporary tessitura, so it's way too high. Using a classical vocal posture in belt. Those 2 things are not the same and never should be associated as being the same, but students can do both. Is the jaw extended beyond speech in the lower part of the voice, where we got this much jaw space and a vowel? Is the student taking too much breath? Always start with sips of air or half breaths first, and then breathe for the task, and just don't suck in all the air you have in the room. Check your subglottic pressure, make sure it's not too much or too little. And then also teach your students how to understand vowel modification as it relates to the passaggio. And the most important thing that I have to say as we end up here is this is why we have jobs, because the psychological concepts, what we think we're doing, are often in complete opposition to physiological systems. So what is really happening versus what we think is happening is very, very different. So I encourage you to think about, when your students, asking your students to explain something to you so that you can help them understand the physiological concept around that versus what the psychological concept that they think they're happening. I promise you, the first time you teach people to make this mixed belt sound, especially with that kind of sound, every student will say, I will never be able to sing like this. I cannot sing like this in public. Well, does it hurt? No, it just sounds really ugly. Okay, well, don't listen to yourself. What does it feel like? Well, it feels pretty good. Okay, good. So let's keep it and see how we can use it in public. So that's my encouragement for all of you. I think we're out of time, but if anybody maybe has a question or two, maybe I can be willing to answer it. Nathan, are we okay on time if we go over?
Yeah, yeah, we have plenty of time. It's up to you, and how long you want to stay. And if you want to put your questions in the chat, or like Kevin mentioned, just turn on your microphone. You can go ahead.
So Amy asked a question about, do you recommend students practice only one style at one time? No. And my reason for saying no is that we don't want to separate singing as being this is one thing and this is another thing and this is another thing. Every teacher in here, once we get beyond posture, once we get beyond the emotional acting parts of it, are only talking about the same things: breath, onset phonation, flow, resonance, and articulation. That's really what we're always playing with. So if our students, I like to have my students maybe start with their classical piece, go into their musical theater piece, and maybe go back to their classical piece, right? But I also want to say that's for students who are wanting to do both. If you have a student who just wants to sing musical theater, I don't think that, some people say, oh, I'm going to give that student Caro Mio Ben because I want to get their head voice organized. Well, that student doesn't want to sing Caro Mio Ben to get their head voice organized. And there's thousands upon thousands of musical theater pieces that are correlates to that type of music. So take something from the canon in which they want to sing and don't scar them by doing a poor job of Caro Mio Ben and call it a head voice exercise, right? So think about how you're using those tools, to benefit the student versus really having them think of those two things as being so different, right? Let's see here. I think I answered that. Okay, good. Okay, good. Any other questions that you guys have? I know online learning, we are so fatigued by this.
Could you maybe just walk us through what you might do in the first 5 to 10 minutes in terms of warming up and kind of physicalizing like you were talking about?
Yeah, sure. So my students have a whole posture sequence that they are using. So I basically have them drop into a squat, kind of get organized so they can actually feel breath down into the pelvic floor for the first time. We have this kind of 6 points of breathing thing that we do. So I have them breathe in the upper part of their back, in the middle of their back, in the lower back, then breathe in their thoracic cavity and feel the ribs and feel it's all breathe, and then feel low into the pelvic floor. It's all breathing. It's all the same muscles being used, but it's giving attention to the student's awareness, physical awareness. And then I usually start with kind of getting the tongue out of the mouth a little bit. So we might do things like where I stick the tongue out and have the student tilt their head back and just yawn. So they can feel that lovely stretch that needs to happen, kind of separating the tongue's relationship from the larynx itself, right? So it starts to create that kind of freedom that we need to have, especially musical theater singing sometimes, because the tongue starts to stabilize the larynx every once in a while, that the hyoid gets a little compressed to the thyroid cartilage. So that's just a good way to kind of say, oh, I'm going to use my hyoglossus, my tongue hyoid connection to stretch that. And then we would start with hums, getting hums organized, making sure they feel airflow through the nose. Versus which is laryngeal. And then we start sliding. And then I have them do whoa, sliding through all parts of their voice. So it's unprescribed. It's just like, let's experiment. Now let's kind of just slide through. And then we start working on getting the breath organized. So we might do like a, and these are all kind of just getting all the things we just stretched to participate. Even the of the tongue between the lips is going to be very, very beneficial, especially for students who think they want to drop into their larynx with their tongue. We see this all the time because students have been told forever to open their throat, right? Well, this is your mouth. this is your throat, right? So what happens is we open the throat, we open the mouth, and we close the throat, right? So when I ask my students all the time, what is the most open throat vowel that you can produce? And they always say ah, and I'm like, no, it's E. E is the most open throat vowel. Right? So they need to understand the difference between the throat and the mouth. And then just, starting into the traditional exercising at that point. But it's just get them stretched, get their body stretched, get their, accessory muscles stretched, especially since we all have terrible posture these days because of our iPhone and being on this medium to teach. You can do things like platysma stretches where you give yourself like an underbite and then look over your shoulders. With that underbite, you'll feel that big stretch. Right, you can feel all those muscles it also helps those sternocleidomastoids stretch a little bit too. But I would say let's, as we're being voice diagnosticians, that it's important for us to start to be aware of where there actually is fault or what we're looking at, what we can see. Do they look rigid? When they walk in the room, you can sometimes tell, or they walk onto Zoom, you can sometimes tell the physicality that's involved in what's going to happen. And you might need to just figure out some stretches that help that student alleviate that versus looking at them and saying, good, can you relax your neck? Can you relax your tongue? Yeah. Can you sing without tension? Well, you're only tension free when you're dead. And if they could have relaxed it in the first place, they probably would have. So it's just bad teaching for us to say, can you relax that? You need to help them relax it. You need to help them find why it's tense, stretch it, and then show them what relaxed feels like so it's a sensation they can get back to. All right? Anybody else have a question?
Thank you. That's really helpful.
Great. Thank you. Anybody else have a question?
Yes. Not a question, but hi, Kevin. For those of you who are watching, I had the privilege of working with him in the NATS intern program. I was one of the interns, or one of the master teachers, and Kevin was also. And what I want to say about you is that I loved the pedagogical information that you gave and how you communicated. And I want to add that if you ever work with Kevin, if you ever have a chance to do that, he makes every second of a lesson fun. That is the one thing that I thought was so wonderful that you did, is that every time I watched you work with somebody, it was a blast. I mean, it really was. So I have these wonderful memories and things, especially, I still do that. I still do that in my studio because it was such a great thing. So.
Dan's my PR manager now. he just got hired.
Yes,
oh, it was so lucky to be there with all those amazing teachers around me. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Sorry to ask another question, but I teach younger students, so high school, and I really appreciated the information about older belt versus more contemporary belt because I find myself always fighting my students on the repertoire that they want to sing and what they can actually handle at this point in their life. Mm-hmm. And I was just wondering if you have any advice on kind of balancing what I know they can handle with letting them stretch a little bit when they're able to.
Well, so I'd always say, have a back burner piece that's fun for them that you can always check in with, but you say, these are the things we need to do. If we do all of these things, then we're going to get to here. But, most students come in, they're like, I want to be an Elphaba. I want to sing Elphaba. Well, that's like an opera student walking in and saying, I want to sing Brunhilde, right? That musical theater canon has a variety of repertoire that is extremely difficult. And it's the stuff we love to hear, like the stuff that like Cynthia Erivo and all these really powerhouse voices are doing versus, but the students don't see is all the work that happened to get them there. Now you look at some of the singers who never did all that work, and they sing that repertoire, they don't last, right? Like the Elphaba, moments are, most of those singers end up in rehab because they didn't take the time to cultivate their voice and the way they needed to, but they could make that sound and it was impressive. So I always tell my students, let's start with something that's really easy for you to do. And then we will, you do this, and then we do this, and then we do this. But I always say, let's have one piece that's kind of, we check in to see how that quality of, how the voice is cultivated, right? but it's just, I know it's so hard, especially with young students, because you want them to trust you and building that trust in the beginning. And so a lot of teachers are, they get concerned that student won't come back if you don't give them the song that they want. Well, it's your name that they are walking around with on their resume when they audition for things with that song, and when they poop the bed with that piece, your name's on their resume. And so I always tell my students, you have to trust me. I promise you, we will get you closer to where you want to be. But also, it's okay to have a conversation with the student and say, I don't know if you're ever going to get to being an alphabet. You may be a really good Glinda, right? So let's figure out. Let's just figure out what your voice is first before we try to put a whole bunch of ideas on it. That's my opinion on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I appreciate it. I've been lucky that usually my students trust me, but there is some fighting occasionally, or just kind of trying to figure out what we can make work.
Yeah, no, I totally understand. All right. So Nathan has the kind of the what are they called? The vocal exercises that you're welcome to have. I'll also put my email in the chat, so you can feel free to reach out to me with any questions that you may have. I love teaching voice, and it never makes me mad when I get an email from a teacher asking me questions. And I might send you one too if you ask me a question, so get ready.
Awesome. Good. Thank you so much. I have all of our members' names who are here, and I can email all of our members. If you are a student in the session, just put your teachers, and if your teacher is not already here, put your teacher's name in the chat. I will email the handouts to your teacher, and then just give them an email saying, hey, I was in the session. You should have received something. That way I can make sure that all the students here get it, and I don't have to email that directly to you. So Kevin, thank you so much for your presentation. It was awesome. Lots of wonderful information, which will be very helpful to all of us. So
great. Thank you so much, Dan. It was so good to see you.
All right. Thank you everyone for joining.